February was a lot more productive than January. This is Toggle. It is time tracking. It's just sort of self-imposed time tracking I do. You can see I spent most of February heads down researching and then a little bit of bookkeeping. If you average out the hours, that's 40 hours a week. Not good enough in my opinion if you're gonna start your own company and kind of do this full time. I hope this number goes up. When I'm done with my day, I'm typically exhausted mentally, and I think that could be due to constant research within Rust, this language I know very little about, so lots of Googling. WGPU, just doing a lot of graphics programming, all of it new to me. It's pretty taxing. Any hours listed here is when I'm actually at the computer with my head down. In a typical corporate office, they say a developer does, even though they might be in the office for 8-9 hours, they do 6.5 hours of dev work because the rest of the time they're checking emails or collaborating, whatever. So maybe this is a slight improvement over the corporate office, but yeah, I hope this number goes up over time and I just have the endurance and capacity to go harder at this. So this month, it started off pretty rough. It ended great. But I ran into a huge problem that took me offline for straight 30 hours. And I jumped into a couple Discord communities, a game dev community for Rust, and just the Rust language games and graphics channel. And I shared that I was having a really tough time with lighting normal maps. Even created a demo because it took so long for me to understand what was happening. I needed to share it with somebody. Nobody really replied, and it was a really good opportunity for me to lean back on myself and sort of ask my own questions of myself. It gave me a different perspective because oftentimes when you work with others, you can just bounce ideas off each other and you end up solving it, but I didn't have that luxury in this case. You could see my light was really angled. This was a point light, and yeah, it wasn't working right. So created an example repo, and this was what I was expecting to see, and I was getting this sort of 50-50 lighting problem. And I created a bunch of sort of debug photos through the shader just by saying, hey, output, the normal texture and the position and things like that, trying to share what I was encountering. It turned out that the core problem was texture format, which I even had a hunch that it was going to be wrong texture format, but it just wasn't apparent. And so, honestly, this was solved by going through every line of code, tweaking things until finally it worked. That was no fun. Then, it worked. So I started working on a point light demo. Here we go. This is an editor, a UI built with eGUI. I think it's probably the most popular GUI system or UI system for Rust so far, and it integrated with WGPU. All right, so point lights, that was diffuse intensity. These are sort of the cutoffs for attenuation. How far does the light go? There's a lot of stylistic things you can do with lights. I ended up changing it after this, but this was, a third. This was on the 10th of February. This came together, and you can see that the texture is just a flat albedo, boring texture. That guy's color was blue. And now you can see what happens when you add some normal maps to a boring texture. You get, angles. It looks 3D, even though the texture, and we're way zoomed in, so it looks like garbage. The texture, the sprite looks three-dimensional. That little guy looks like he could be rotated and he's in a 3D world. Messing around with some point light stuff. Now I'm gonna mess with the directional light. So there's one directional light in the scene. It's different from a point light in that it's not localized. It kind of represents the sun. The rays are uniform. And changing the direction of the light looks pretty cool. This ambient intensity really makes it feel like you can start to see things. Diffuse intensity, that's just how bright is the sun. There you go, you can see the flat, when it's just ambient light, it's the flat color of the texture, but as soon as you add some diffuse intensity where the normals can operate independently from each other, it looks pretty good. Maybe this is starting to become evening time. It's the twilight hours. This kind of stuff makes me excited because I can imagine a world with non-natural elements, magical things happening, floating around. Then I worked on an art pipeline. This is a sprite. It's good for making pixel art. This file has 2 animations, an idle, a walk right. It's got 4 layers, and 2 of the layers one layer has these little blob deals, and the other is this green band, and then there's normals for both the blobs and the green bands. And so this is what my brother will use to make art. And if I, for example, edit this layer property and let's say set opacity, which is the transparency, to 180, that's going to add some translucence. Is that a word? Translucency. It's going to make it give it some alpha. And then I have this pipeline. It runs a script. It targets multiple sprite files. It explodes them into individual images and breaks them out between normal images and albedo, which is just your standard material texture, to a final output that looks like that. You call that a texture atlas or a sprite sheet. And this is a giant grass from one texture, and this is the blobs from that other sprite file. And it creates this custom JSON file that I can load into my game engine, storing things like the offset into the texture for the frame I want to be drawing, how wide is it, things like that. So opacity. Let's do this. So I made a change. I set this first layer to 180, save, and then if I run this, I explode for some reason. Keeping the layers on is helpful. And then run it. Okay, it just created new files there, and if I pull them in, copy, paste into my engine. Obviously all this will be streamlined in the future once I've really got it nailed down, but this is kind of just copy paste as we go right now. And if I pull up the engine, I implemented deferred rendering and forward rendering. It's just a compile switch here. And deferred rendering it's harder than forward. Forward is typical, and it uses the painter algorithm, which says draw the backmost objects first and then draw on top of them. Deferred lets you go in the other order. Actually, you can go in the other order for both, but deferred it has additional complexity I won't get into, which lets you add a lot of point lights to the scene without incurring a cost to that. Lights are really expensive because you end up, for every single object, for every single light, you have this exponential increase in a performance hit in the fragment shader to represent lighting. Deferred lets you kind of just do everything once, and that's great, but you give up transparency when you use deferred because everything is stored in a texture and you don't have multiple layers of that texture. And so what I worked on was a lot of sprite batching logic that basically says if you're an opaque sprite, you're going to be drawn in the deferred pass. If you're a transparent sprite, you'll be drawn in the forward pass afterwards. And you'll be placed correctly within the scene because that stencil buffer will remember where depth-wise in the scene a pixel lives and whether the pixel you're trying to draw right now is in front of or behind the pixel that already exists. So let's run this. And you can see we get 3 little jumpy boys. The front guy and the back guy are doing a different animation than this middle blob. The blobs have some transparency. You can probably see that green band coming through. The green band itself is opaque. It's almost like a little ghost blob wearing a necklace or something. And this just came together yesterday, where these 3 opaque necklaces are drawn in a single deferred rendering pass, and the 3 blobs are drawn afterwards in a forward render pass. And I can add another blob to the scene, and if I put him, respecting the vertical y-axis, it orders that blob in front, as you'd expect. And if I bring him up behind, he looks like he's actually behind the other blobs. So the Y ordering is working. I can add a bunch of these guys. And add a new point light. It's kind of, the lighting it's working. Let's make that really intense. Give it a purple color. Maybe we'll add another point light up over here to see some blending. And bring that way up. It's white right now, but let's make it green. There we go. So as it jumps away from this light, it becomes all green and then becomes purple again. Give the scene some ambient light. This was, a lot of the code this month was in the sprite batching, figuring out the logic for the forward pass and the deferred pass and how to keep all the sprites sorted correctly. Yeah.